Let's get to the bottom of bias. Here to discuss is Kelly McBride, Senior Faculty for Ethics at the Poynter Institute. Thanks so much, Kelly, for being here.
You're welcome.
Well, let's get right to it. Is the media biased?
Some of the media is biased, and some of the media isn't biased, and sometimes certain types of media think they're not biased, but they really are. So I can't really answer that question carte blanche.
Interesting. I don't know what carte blanche means. I do know that my media is not biased because it is fair and balanced. It says so.
Yes, well, that's one way that you could judge it. Another way might be to ask if you get a different variety of opinions when you consume your media. That would be another way to tell.
How do you measure something like bias?
You can't measure bias. In fact, we don't even have a really good definition of bias. So we can talk about different outlets that seem to be more biased, and we can talk about some of their practices that seem to make them more biased, but it's actually a really squishy term, and it's very hard for people to talk about what it means in an objective sense, but it's also really hard to talk about it because it's hard to talk about other people's biases without analyzing what your own biases are.
Do you think that the media shapes our opinions, or do we seek out media sources that reflect the views that we already hold?
Well, it really depends on who you are. A certain part of the population does seek out information that reflects a certain political philosophy or worldview. The studies show that it's about 30% of the population, and that's actually remained steady since the late 1970s. Those numbers are self-reported, though, and they don't account for self-bias. Most people, I think, can recognize information that maybe challenges their worldview but is factual. And that's really, as a consumer, the type of information that you should be looking for.
We all know that Fox News probably resides on the right and MSNBC on the left. Is CNN, are they splitting the middle? And who decides the tone of the news? Is that a corporate decision, or who decides what gets reported?
Well, most of the time it is a corporate decision. And certainly you see organizations like Fox making a clear and deliberate choice to try and appeal to a certain demographic. MSNBC, the same thing on the other side. CNN is making a market-based decision where they want to get the middle of the market. So those are decisions that are made at an executive level. The other problem with bias, though, is bias can creep in even in spite of those sort of corporate decisions. So you could have an individual reporter or a producer have a bias on a certain story. It might be a story about evolution or global warming or racism. And that bias can creep into a story in spite of some corporate directive to have the story have another type of bias.
So Roger Ailes over at Fox News, let's say, does he consider himself the same type of journalist as those over at the New York Times, or is he in the entertainment business?
You know, I don't think that Roger Ailes would categorize himself as being in the entertainment business. I think he thinks of himself as the equivalent of the editor of the New York Times or the head of the BBC. And, you know, because even though I think he would say that his demographic is a conservative audience, just because news is biased doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. You know, most of the news organizations in Europe have been operating with a political point of view for decades, and democracy seems to work there just fine. So there's a difference between bad journalism and biased journalism, and sometimes they're synonymous, but they are not always synonymous. So I think Roger Ailes aims to provide information to conservatives that is factual, and sometimes he hits the mark and sometimes he doesn't.
So Fox News is concerned with ratings, and the New York Times, their priority is obviously selling newspapers. Is that a conflict of interest? Does that inherently create a biased journalism?
It actually creates a type of bias. It's a type of bias against being boring. It's a type of bias against losing money, although sometimes both of those organizations do lose money in spite of their best intentions. The business model, whether you are aiming to provide news through a political lens or news through no lens at all, the business model itself is a form of bias because it leads the editors and the news directors to choose certain types of stories that they think will appeal to a wide audience. So it is a form of bias. You know, there's other forms of news like nonprofit, like National Public Radio is a nonprofit organization. That leads to a different type of bias in the news that they choose. So, I mean, that's the thing is bias doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. In fact, it's probably something that we talk about as if it's really dangerous, and really it's ever present.
Well, do you think that here in America we're moving toward more of a European system in our journalism, and what sort of effects will that have?
You know, I do think that we're moving closer to the model that they have in Europe, although not completely. The difference is in Europe, most of the news products are national products. They serve an entire nation or even a wider geographic area. Most of our news products here are local products. We have a few national products, like some of the television broadcast networks that we've talked about. But most of our news actually comes from local institutions, local television, local newspapers. And in those cases, I think that they will resist the urge to completely adopt a point of view, especially if that point of view is dramatically different from their community, because it would be a bad business decision. But I also think that communities change. I mean, just since 2000, we've seen the evolution of the red states and blue states into something that seems really entrenched. But that won't always stay the same. And so it's really hard for a news organization to say, oh, because we're in a red state, we're now going to reflect red state ideology. Because 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that might change. Certain states are going to flip from red to blue or blue to red. And when that happens, it will be really hard for those news organizations to change their identity and change their brand. So the business model drives all of this. And for most news organizations, it's not going to make sense to adopt a political point of view.
What impact has the internet had on the business of journalism and on bias?
So on the business of journalism, the internet has had a huge impact. It's taken away advertising, which is mainly how most news organizations are supported, particularly local newspapers. So you see the newspaper business in crisis because the economic model has crumbled. So one thing that the internet has done is it's made the news a lot more clever, a lot funnier, if you will. And that's because the internet values humor. If you look on Twitter, one of the things that you notice is that people make jokes all the time, and journalists make jokes all the time. They try and be very, very clever. And when you're trying to be funny, you often reveal what your bias is. Because you're going to make fun of people that you don't like. You're going to make, if you're a liberal, you might make fun of conservatives. If you're a conservative, you might make fun of liberals. So humor tends to reveal your bias more so than boring would reveal your bias. So the internet has made the news funnier and actually more easier to consume.
Why do you think that conservatives have not been able to successfully respond to shows like The Daily Show or The Colbert Report? What's holding them back?
Man, I could get into so much trouble answering this question. It could be that conservatives just aren't very funny. You know, the conservatives tend to be more about anger and righteousness, and liberals tend to be more about cleverness.
Is there a way for individuals to act as media watchdogs, and what would you recommend for someone seeking out a balanced diet of media?
So if you want to be a media watchdog, consume a lot of media and try and develop relationships with media organizations. Social media makes that so easy. Every media organization has an identity on Facebook, on Twitter, on Pinterest or Instagram, on Tumblr. And if you want to be a watchdog, you can interact with those organizations on those platforms, and you can ask questions like, why did you choose this story? Or when you told that story, how come you didn't interview the other point of view? So that's a great way to hold different media organizations accountable. Actually, Facebook is a great place to get a wide variety of viewpoints. And one of the things that you shouldn't do if you want to get a wide variety of viewpoints is unfriend everybody on Facebook who offends you, which I saw a lot of people doing after the election. Instead, I think you should reach out to those people and have conversations with them, or at the very least, listen to what they're saying and try to understand. But in addition to Facebook and other social media platforms, I think every responsible citizen should have three different sources of information that reflect a different viewpoint. So you might have your local newspaper, you might have a magazine, and you might have a broadcast program that all come from a different point of view. So, for instance, I watch Fox News all the time because I want to try and understand the audience that they are trying to reach. In addition to that, I listen to National Public Radio, which is pretty much down the middle. I think it used to be much more liberal than it is now. NPR is, I think, pretty straight and down the middle. But then I also might consume something like Salon or the Huffington Post as a way of getting my liberal point of view as well.
Kelly McBride, thanks so much for being with us today. Very insightful.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.